Hi, quilting friends! This is Miss Bunny. I am so excited. Today I want to teach you how to make this fun doll. So this is a new sewing pattern that you can find at leahday.com/bunny. She is so much fun to put together. I promise that you are going to have to make more than one. We have a couple different options that you can do with her ears, and you're going to learn lots of different fun techniques, including how to sew darts on her face, how to stitch her face with an embroidery floss, how to stuff the doll, all kinds of good stuff. So let's get started and make a Miss Bunny doll together. So the first step to creating Miss Bunny is to cut out all of her pieces. And please refer to your pattern as far as how you need to arrange this. I've got 4 layers here, so that way I can cut out all of her arms, legs, and ear pieces all at once. Over here, I have a fold that only goes up this far for her body front, back, her head, and then I only need one of the center head pieces, so that's only on a single layer here. So go on ahead and get everything arranged, pinned into place, and I just cut this out with a pair of scissors. That's quick enough. And I find that that works really well. You can also use a really small rotary cutter if you have one. A 28mm blade would be pretty good for this because it will be able to get into all of those nooks and crannies. But curves like around her foot and around her paw, those curves I typically always cut those by hand with a pair of scissors. Okay, so that's how you're going to take care of your cutting. Now let's start talking about piecing. So here are the first pieces we're going to play with. We're going to play with her legs and her ears. We have some nice big floppy ears and her paws, her arms. Here we go. Now there are definitely a lot of marks and different lines and dots to put on your pieces. Make sure to refer to your pattern pieces for this. On the arms and legs, you'll want to mark the dashed lines on the right sides of the fabric on all of those pieces. That's going to guide us for cinching up her arms and legs so that way she can have knees and elbows and be a little bit more bendy and flexible. We also have some dots here. Make sure to mark those as well on the wrong side of your pattern. Now the ears are the absolute simplest. There's no lines to mark or dots to worry about. For piecing this, you're going to start on the upper edge and stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the ear. And you want to back stitch at the beginning and end of all of these seams to reinforce them, because then after you stitch that seam, you're going to turn the ear right side out. So let me show you how to do this. Here is a beautifully stitched ear, and you can see that nice 1/4 inch seam allowance, but that seam allowance is just a little bit bulky. So I'm actually going to trim that down. I'm going to grab a pair of scissors and I'm just cutting 1/8 of an inch off of that seam allowance. What that's going to do is it's going to reduce bulk. It's going to make it much easier to turn out, and then the edges of the ear are going to rest nice and flat. So anywhere in the pattern that I mention trimming the seam, this is what you're going to do. You're just going to cut down and reduce that by half. So whenever I'm trimming this down, I'm always just eyeballing right through the center of that seam allowance. I don't want to get too close to the stitching, obviously, but I also want to make sure that I get a nice bit of that fabric cut away. Okay, so now let's turn this right side out. I'm just going to stick my thumb into it, push it through, and then keep working it inside out. And then at some point you can just start to slide your hand over it and the whole ear will, it's like an envelope, it'll turn right around. There we go. And then actually getting it flat can sometimes take a minute or two. What I like to do is I like to just roll the seam back and forth in my fingertips just like that, and that encourages the stitching line to come nice and flush with the edge of the ear. So just take your time working your way around the ear, and that's going to ensure that the outside edge is nice and smooth and just looks great. And here we go. That is a finished ear, all pressed flat, looking good. There's lots of different things you could do to embellish your bunny's ear if you wanted to. You could do a decorative stitch around the outer edge. You could applique a bit of fuzzy fabric like minky to the front, actually to both sides. You could do that to both sides. That would be kind of cool. In the pattern, we have two different types of ears, and there's only one way to modify it. A flat ear is just like this. It's just simple and flat, and you don't do anything to the top edge. Now, if you want a pleated ear, you just simply take it and fold it in half, just like this. Now you can pin it. When you take it and put it on the head, you'll stitch across, and that will create that nice pleat. It's really pretty. So try it both ways and see which way you like it best. So now that we've got the ears knocked out, let's talk through the arms and legs, because both of these pieces are pieced similarly, and they are pieced with dot-to-dot sewing. So here we go. What we're going to do is get started on the edge of the arm, and we're going to stitch to the dot and back stitch and break thread, and then get started again on the next dot, back stitch, and go all the way around the arm, and then stop right here on the end. What this is going to do is it's going to leave an opening here on the edge and an opening between those two dots. We're going to use this opening for stuffing the upper part of the arm. We'll use this opening for stuffing the inner part of the arm. So it's good to have both places open. The same thing we're going to do with the leg. We're going to start on the edge, back stitch, stitch to the dot, back stitch again, break thread, start on the dot, back stitch, go all the way around that leg and back up and back stitch at the edge. And that's again going to leave the space between the dots and this upper edge of the leg open. So let's take this to the machine and I'll show you how to stitch it. So this is my Eversewn Sparrow 20 sewing machine, and I am using stitch number 1, and I'm not going to change where the needle is located. It's at 3.5, and that's right in the middle, so that's good. But I am going to lower my stitch length. That's at 2.5 millimeters, and I'm going to lower that down to 1.5 millimeters so my stitches are nice and small and secure, and that's going to ensure none of the stuffing in the middle of the bunny leaks out. So the first thing I do is I stitch through a scrap charger like this, and what this does is it just gets your machine in stitching mode. It stops you from wasting bobbin thread, and it ensures if the machine's going to gag when you first get started, that's going to happen on a scrap rather than on your piece, on your doll piece. Okay, so now I'm going to lift up the foot slightly and slip that leg. I'm going to slip that upper edge of the leg under the foot. I'm going to take about 3 stitches and then back stitch. And that's securing that edge. Because I'm going to be filling this, it's really important to back stitch all of these seams because they're going to get a little bit of stress. So now I'm going to stitch right up to the dot. There we go. And again, I'm going to take 3 stitches back and then 3 stitches forward. There we go. And then I'm going to lift the foot and break thread. Unfortunately, you can't use your scrap charger all the time, so I'm going to have long thread tails this time, but that's okay. There we go. So now I'm going to tuck the foot back underneath, tuck the leg back underneath the foot. Oh, this is funny. I'm working with body parts. All right, 3 stitches forward here, 3 stitches back, and then now we're ready to go. So my goal here, number 1, I am using a 1/4 inch patchwork foot because that's what we're working with on this doll. We're working with 1/4 inch seams throughout. And in order to piece this nice and accurately, it just really does help to have a 1/4 inch patchwork foot. And I'm just keeping those seam allowances nice and lined with that outer edge of the foot. Now my machine will automatically end with the needle in the down position. Sometimes I just have to tap the foot, so that way the needle always ends down, so I can lift the foot slightly and rotate the foot piece around the, like I said, appendages here. So I can rotate the fabric around underneath the foot as I go, because as you can see, we've got a nice smooth curve here. I want to make sure that's going to end up being a nice smooth curve as I stitch all the way around. So there we go. It is a little challenging to describe this as I am, using a 1/4 inch patchwork foot as I stitch a foot. So it's really kind of funny. There we go. Now, once you get around that shape, it is much easier because all you have to do is just pedal to the metal is a nice long straight stitch to the end. So now I'm going to stitch Miss Bunny's arm just the exact same way, right up to the dot, back stitch, and break thread, and then start again at that dot. And whenever I have the thread tails and I'm not using a scrap charger, I just hang on to them in my right hand and just give that just a little bit of tension so that the thread tails don't get sucked down into the machine. And then once I take a stitch or two, then they're solid. Back stitch again. And the arm is just a little tricky because we're going to go around this paw shape, and the thumb, where we change direction for the thumb, is just a little tricky. So let's talk through it. As I go around the curve, I'm going to move my hand to the back where I have the presser foot lifter, and I'm just going to lift up on that. And I just did that with the needle up. I want to do that with the needle down from now on, so that way the piece doesn't slide away from my foot. There we go. So what I'm going to do is lift up slightly, and then I'm doing just a little rotate. Now the tip of the paw here is pretty tight, so I'm going to only take about 1 or 2 stitches before I shift and rotate things around. So keep that in mind. You might only be taking 1 or 2 stitches, just 2 or 3 quick little stitches, just like that, before you change direction again. Looks like I need to come down 1 more stitch to be in the right place. There we go. Now I'm going to change direction for the little thumb, just like so. And it really helps. Like, I can just tap my foot pedal and take 1 stitch at a time, or half a stitch, lift the needle, drop the needle, and that's really useful for those areas. Okay, once you work your way out of the tricky spot, then you can move your hands back and just work to keep those fabrics in nice alignment all the way down. I'll back stitch at the end, and our arms and legs will be complete. So here are my arms and legs, and I have already trimmed down the seam allowance on 2 of these pieces. And I want you to notice that I did not trim the seam allowance around those dots. We're going to be hand stitching those openings closed, and so it's really useful to have your full seam allowance in those areas. Now, one thing you want to do is just make a little notch here where the thumb changes direction, where you have that deepest curve in the paw. You also want to give a little notch. Same thing, you're just clipping the fabric very slightly. You're not going to cut the stitching, just clip into that ever so slightly, and that's going to just help it turn. Okay, so now we're going to turn this foot right side out. And I just like to kind of start from the end, from the foot, and work my way through, and I just kind of pull it all onto a fingertip like that, and I wiggle back and forth to get the foot inside, right side out, and then the rest of it pulls right through, just like so. And again, you'll go through and really work these edges until they're nice and flat. And same thing with the arm. I think I'll start, I'm gonna start from this end. I just think it's easier just to work like this and kind of get your thumb into it a little bit, or a pinky finger in this case. This is a much smaller piece. Here we go. And I'm just rolling it back along those seam allowances, just like so. And there we go. Once you get it started, it just really goes fast. And then it goes right side out. Okay, now getting all of these little shapes, like we've got that little thumb, and the curving end of the paw can be just a little bit tricky. I'm going to grab a chopstick and just give it a gentle poke here. Just a gentle poke, just like that. That looks great. Okay, so once you get your paws to this point, we want to do what's called a half fill. What we're going to do is stuff these so that only the first half of the appendage is filled, and then we're going to stitch across it to secure all of that stuffing inside. And we want to fill this end of the foot and the paw nice and firm and stiff. So here I have already filled this one in, and just in case you'd like to see me do this, I'm going to grab a little bit of fiber fill here, and I'll show you how I do it. So I just grab a piece about this big and kind of give it a little bit of a fluff, just like so. And especially for the paw, because we've got such little details here, maybe break this in half, so about that much. Insert it in the end, And then I use that blunt end of the chopstick to mush it all the way down and get it to the very tip of the paw, just like so. And then once you get it down there, it's just a matter of manipulating it, of getting it packed in nicely. And the more time you spend on this, the nicer and smoother of a curve you're going to have, and the firmer feel it's going to be. So just take your time with this more than anything else. It's just one of those little fiddly kind of things. I really enjoy filling up Miss Bunny paws whenever I'm watching TV with my son, or just sitting on the couch. It's not a big deal, but it's one of those things that does take just a little bit of time in the process. So that's how I fill that up. And you just have to kind of go by feel as far as how much you want to use. What you want to do is be able to fill it in nice and densely so that it has a firm feel. You can see it's a good whackable whackable leg there. And here you can see one of my finished paws. Same thing. It's a good firm feel to it. That thumb is not going to collapse. A little bit squishy fingers, but that's really good. And then you don't want it so full that you can't access this stitching line. So that's what this dashed line is that we marked on the right side. What you want to do is fill your arm up to that line so it feels nice and firm, and then take your chopstick and really give it a good hard pack, a good squish down. Because now we're going to take these arms and legs to our machine, and we're going to stitch across this with a nice long stitch length, and that's going to create a stitch that allows us to cinch that arm up, creating a nice bendy elbow. So I'm here at my machine, and I've stuffed Miss Bunny's paw nice and firm up to that marked line on the arm, and the same thing with the leg. Now the leg's a little different. You can see on the arm, we're going from the seam to the seam. So that way she'll have thumb pointing up or thumb pointing down. That's the way the arm should be. But on the legs, I've taken the leg and rotated it and brought those seams together in the center. So in this case, I'm going to be stitching from this folded edge across the center seam stacked up together. You can see they're front and back, they're stacked up together, and then end on this folded edge over here. And what that does is that makes the leg point forward or back rather than to one side. So that's just an extra little detail and something different between the two limbs. Okay, so here on my machine, I'm on stitch number 1. That's just my normal straight stitch. And I'm going to adjust the stitch length up to 4 millimeters. That's going to produce a really big stitch, because what I want to do is stitch across, then pull on the threads and cinch this up to make nice elbows and knees. Okay, I'm going to grab my chopstick again and just give this a firm little pack here. And use the wide end so that just packs everything down into Miss Bunny's arm real nice and firmly. And that's just giving me a little bit of space here so I can stitch across and have room for my foot. You can see now I can place this here and the foot's not going to get squished by the stuffing. All right, I'm going to hang on to both my thread tails, and I want these thread tails to be nice and long. So I'm not using my scrap charger. I'm going to hang on to the thread tails instead. And I'm going to carefully stitch across. And I just want to make sure that that line stays a nice straight and I don't wiggle and wobble around. That looks great. Again, break nice long thread tails. And here's what you do. You take one of those threads and give it a tug. Whoop. Actually, first thing you need to do is tie a knot on one side. So here we go. I'm going to take this shorter set of thread tails and I'm going to tie an overhand knot. Basically, you make a loop and then pass the thread tails through that loop and then tighten it down. Okay, so that's an overhand knot that I have tied here right on the edge of that foot, on that arm. Okay, now on this side, I'm going to do what I said. I'm going to grab one thread tail and tug on it. Look what happens. Cinches up real nice. Okay, now I'm going to grab both of those thread tails again and tie that in another overhand knot. I've got too much thread here. Break that a little shorter. There we go. And it is make a loop, pass the thread tails through that loop. It kind of looks like a pencil. That's what it looks like. And then you tighten it down, and you can see I've lost a little bit of my cinch here, so I want to tighten that up a little bit. You can always adjust. I'm just pulling on that just a bit, just to make sure it's nice and squished up. And it looks like my knot's not going to work out there. That's okay. You can always tie another one. Tie another knot here. There we go. So now I have my cinch stitch and knots on both ends. And then to hide these thread tails, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a cheater needle. This is also a self-threading needle. That's also another name it goes by. It's got a groove in the top that just makes it really easy to thread. And I just gently pop those thread tails into the top of that needle. And what I'm going to do is take a few back stitches right around this edge of the arm. So I'm just going to loop around and loop around again, just like so. This is just reinforcing that stitching. And yes, I am using contrasting thread here so you can see what I'm doing. I would not normally use contrasting thread for this. I would use beige thread to go with a beige fabric doll. So that is just something I'm doing just for you guys so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so I've gone around 3 times. Now I'm going to back stitch, just going right through that stitching. Maybe 1 or 2 stitches. This just reinforces it. You know, it's only 1 line of stitching, holding that elbow, you know, cinching it up, making it look nice. So I just want to make sure it's not going to go anywhere. Now I'm going to again do another overhand knot. This is getting a little bit tight, so I apologize if you can't quite see what I'm doing, but basically it's just another overhand knot right there. Now I'm going to insert my needle coming from that stitching and run it into the stuffed part of the doll and pull it through. And so that's where the thread tails are going through that stuffed part of the doll. I can clip that off. You won't be able to tell. I'm going to do that exact same thing with this other side. I have a knot tied right here. I'm going to take a few back stitches around that outer edge and then stitch a few times into the cinch stitching. You know, it's however as much reinforcing as you want to do, and then knot it again and send the thread tails through the arm, and then you can clip them off and that arm will be complete. So that's how we take care of the arms, and we get nice little elbows going, and we do not stuff the upper section of the arm. That makes it much easier to put Miss Bunny together. Now let's do a leg together, and like I said, you want to stack these seam allowances, so I'm just feeling those seam allowances, making sure they're stacked up nicely together. And I'm again going to grab my chopstick and give this a little pack, making sure that I can fit my presser foot over this leg and be able to stitch across. And I'm just making sure that those seams are stacked up nicely together. That's really the biggest key here. Now I'm going to drop my foot. Again, make sure that my stitch length is nice and big. Hang on to those nice long thread tails. That's a key. That way they don't get sucked down into the machine. There we go. And then make nice long thread tails as we pull it off. Again, I'm going to tie an overhand knot. Let's see if I can make this just even more clear than I have before. It's a simple loop, and then reach through that loop and grab those thread tails. And I'm going to bring that loop down right to the edge of the leg. So now I have the leg, the stitching, and then a knot right here on the end. And that's just going to hold that in place so that way I can take a hold of these threads and be able to cinch it up. So I call this the cinch stitch, and it's just a gathering stitch to give us nice arms and, nice elbows and knees. Now, if this is a struggle for you and you just can't seem to get it, please understand that you can also just do a regular straight stitch across, and that would look just fine too. You know, there's no right or wrong way of doing it, and if this is not something that you like the look of, please feel like you can change it and play around with it and make your Miss Bunny doll a little different. That's okay. Okay, so let's see here if I can get this. As you can see, it's just a little tricky to get that cinch real nice and tight and grab a hold of both threads and tie them in a knot all together. But there we go. Looks like we got it. I'm gonna make a loop, pass the thread tails through the loop, tighten down my knot. There we go. Nicely cinched up leg. And now grab my cheater needle again pop those thread tails into the eye of that cheater needle. There we go. And now again, I'm going to do back stitches along this edge. Just take a stitch, loop around, take a stitch. And what this is doing is just reinforcing those corners, which are kind of the weak point. And also we have a knot right there. I'm kind of covering up that knot a little bit too. So a couple different things. All right, take one more. And then again, I'll just take a few stitches here, kind of spread out that cinch stitch so the gathers are nice and even. And I'll just take a few stitches, going back and forth, making sure I'm stitching right on that line. And this is nearly invisible if you are using thread that matches color. It really is. It blends in really nicely if you use beige thread. There we go. And take one more stitch. I think that looks great. Okay, and one more time. Make an overhand knot. And this one, I'm bringing that overhand knot down to about 1/8 of an inch from that surface of the paw, or sorry, the foot, because I want this knot to be able to pop inside and bury. If you bring it too close to the fabric, sometimes it won't bury. So now I'll insert the cheater needle into that leg, run it a short distance, and pull it through. There we go. Now just clip that off. You can see just how nice that looks. All cinched up. She's got a nice little wobbly knee. And now we have a foot that points forward rather than to one side. So there we go. That's how we're going to make both arms and legs. Make sure to take your time doing the opposite side of that stitching. You know, we've already got a knot, do some back stitches and send it through, and then clip off your thread tails. So now let's start putting Miss Bunny's head together. You'll need to mark the lines for the dart on the lower edge of the head. Make sure you've got the nose dot marked, the eye dot too, and these dash lines for the ears. Now the next step is to stitch your dart. Take the head and fold it in half just like this, bringing the wide ends of that dart together so that those lines are stacked right on top of one another. And then you have a nice straight line running from the edge of the head down to that dart point. You're going to take this to the machine and stitch on this line, back stitching at the beginning and end to secure it. And here's what that will look like whenever you get it stitched. That just adds a nice curve to Miss Bunny's head. And I take that dart and I press it to the back, so it's pointing to the back of her head away from the nose and eye dots, just like that. Okay, so now we need to attach the ear, and we want to just simply baste this in place on the right side of the head, but there's two different ways that you can fix your ear. If you want Miss Bunny's ear to be really nice and open and flat, just leave it exactly the way it is. Take it, center it up between those marks at the top of the head, and just stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the top edge. And here's what that's going to look like. You can see I just ran a little line of stitching 1/8 of an inch from the edge, just holding that ear nicely in place. Now, if you want to make a pleated ear, all you're going to do is take that ear and fold it in half, bringing those edges, those outer edges together, just like that. Now take your head, and you're going to take the pleated ear and just center it up between those marks for the head, for the ear at the top. Just center it up because obviously now it's folded in half. It's going to take up a lot less space. So just try and find a nice medium right in the middle. And we're folding this and placing it so that the opening is opening towards the side with Miss Bunny's face. The fold of that ear is facing towards the back of her head. So just again, run a line of stitching right across the top, and that will secure it. And that's just really nice to baste it in place so it's not going to wobble around on you. And here's what that will look like whenever you get it stitched. Now the next step is to stitch the center piece of her head in place, but I don't want this ear to get in my way. So I'm going to take a pen and just stick it right through all of those layers. That's just going to secure and hold it down, so that way that's not going to go anywhere. I'm going to place that on my table, and now I'm going to grab the center head piece. There's a few marks and things you want to do with this piece. Make sure to mark that nose dot, that point right at the end. That's super important. Also, you've got little notches for the ears. You can line up these ear marks. Now, you can always mark a mark with a pencil, or I like sometimes to just do a little clip. And you can see here, that clip is only clipping out 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric, not very much at all. You don't want to get too aggressive with that. Obviously, we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, but you can do clips instead of marks, whichever one you prefer. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to match up dot to dot. So there's a dot on that nose, and then there's a dot on Miss Bunny. And basically, if you match up that nice angle from the head centerpiece with the nice angle on Miss Bunny's head, then it's all going to match up just exactly right. And we are going to start stitching exactly on that dot. We don't want to stitch into that seam allowance because that would mess up another step. So that nose dot's nicely pinned. Now I'll come all the way around, and I'm going to line up this straight edge of the head center with the bottom edge of the side head piece. Line up those edges and place a pin. And then I really like minimal pinning, but you can pin this as much or as little as you like. It's totally up to you. So up here we have little notches where I've clipped out for the head, for those ears, and I'm just lining up and matching those notches. And I'm going to place a pin right before the first one. That looks good. And like I said, you can sit here and ease the fabric through and kind of fiddle with it a little bit, and you can pin as much or as little as you like. I don't like a lot of pins. They kind of tend to get in my way, and I like to be able to manipulate the fabric on the machine, but this is totally up to you. So this piece is ready to go. Let's go to the machine and stitch from the dot all the way around to the bottom of the head. So here at my machine, I'm just making sure that the edges of those pieces are in nice alignment, and I want to start right on that dot. So I'm going to slide the pieces underneath the foot. I'm still using my 1/4 inch patchwork foot. I'm going to use my hand wheel to drop the needle down and bring it back up again. Now if I tug on the needle, if I tug on that top thread, I'll bring up a loop. I pull on that loop, that's my bobbin thread. Now I can take both thread tails and tuck them underneath the foot. That's why they won't get sucked into my machine. Now I'm going to take 3 careful stitches forward, 1 more, and then 3 careful stitches back. The most important thing here is just don't stitch backwards over that dot and into the seam allowance on the opposite side. That will mess up the last seam we have to stitch for the head. So just be careful about that. Now you can see this is why I like only putting 3 pins in the head, because once you get started, all you have to do is just ease the fabric out real gently. Just make sure that those edges are in nice alignment, and you're keeping it in line also with the edge of the patchwork foot. There we go. And I like to keep my thumb here underneath the head center piece. And I'm constantly mushing and feeling things, making sure that something hasn't folded over, I don't have a pleat in the fabric, it's not doing something weird. You might even want to lift up on the foot slightly and feel the edges of the ear just to make sure they're not curling up or doing anything weird on you. There we go. And it's a bit of a hump to get over that ear, so watch out for that too. All right, now we're coming down the other side, and just like before, I just want to smooth that out and work about 1/2 inch at a time, smoothing out the fabric and making sure I'm not going to stitch a pleat in either side. So I'm just manipulating this gently. As you can see, I've got just a little bit of fabric wiggling around on me, a little bit of fabric wiggling around the other way. And my dad would sometimes take a pair of tweezers. I've got this little brush here that's got a little pokey end. I'm going to just use that to smooth that out. That might be something. A stiletto can be really useful. So there we go. Just smooth it out. And then once you get around to where you can hang on to the needle, this pen that we have placed here, that can be really useful. Sometimes just giving that a very gentle tug can encourage those fabrics to lay down nicely and go together. Now if you fear that you're going to stitch a pleat, if you see like fabric doing this number, kind of getting all bunchy like that, lift up on the foot and just smooth it out. There we go. And even if you do stitch a pleat in your head, it's not the end of the world. Rip out that area right around it and then stitch it again, smoothing it out, and that should work out just fine. Now I'm going to take a few stitches here, back stitch, and that's the first half of the head stitched. So there is half the head stitched. Now let's grab the other half, and I've just prepped this up the exact same way. I have Miss Bunny's ear here, fold it in half nicely. I'm going to grab a pin so I can pin that, make sure it's not going to flop out of my way. One time I stitched her head and it was on this seam, which is a little tricky seam. Her ear got caught in it. So it is a good idea to pin her ears out of the way. You never know what they might do. All right, so here we go. This time I'm going to start with the ear marks and I'm going to pin from there. It really doesn't matter which you pin because all of these marks are accurately placed, so you can pin from the center and work your way down to both sides, or you can work from the nose or from the back. It's totally up to you. And place a pin there, and then work my way around and place a pin right on that nose. And there again, we want to make sure that we start stitching right on that dot and we don't stitch into that seam allowance, because the last step of Miss Bunny's head will be stitching this last seam that runs down the center for her mouth. Okay, we're going to take this to the machine and stitch it the exact same way. Now this side of the head is ever so slightly trickier, so you'll just want to pay attention because you've got things that could get caught in the seam. Like I said, the ears or the other side of the head. So just be really mindful of that. Whenever I'm sewing or quilting, I'm always feeling the thing I'm sewing and feeling for lumps and bumps and weird things that might be extra layers I shouldn't be stitching through. Okay, just like before, I'm going to drop the needle down, bring it all the way up, give that bobbin thread a tug, and bring it up to the surface. Tuck both thread tails underneath the needle, underneath the foot, so that way it doesn't get sucked into the machine. Couple stitches forward. Oop, don't take an extra stitch. Lift the foot slightly and nudge it forward just to be sure. There we go. Okay, so now I'm just going to smooth everything out. Begin stitching. And I've got my pen here placed on the ear mark. And you know, it's going to be funny just to see which you find easier, whether you find it easier to stitch with the center of the head up, which is what we were stitching the first time around, or you like the side head facing up. You know, it's really two different ways, and you're going to have to stitch it both ways in order to be able to stitch from the dot and around. Okay, so I'm right here on the ear, and just like before, I like to just double check those ears. They can be just a little weird. I know Dad, when he pieced his Miss Bunny doll, his ears kind of winged even backwards. It's like they put in an extra pleat. Which, you know, if you really want to get creative, you could do all kinds of different pleats with those ears. So definitely something to play with. But he was not intending that whenever he was putting his ears in place. All right, here we go. A little bit of a tricky spot, might bind up a little bit because you're going through so many layers. Bring your hand to the back here, as you can see, and give it a little tug. And that can sometimes help. And really your goal is just to keep the edges of the fabric in nice alignment so that they're lined up along the outer edge. Keep them in line with the edge of your patchwork foot. And yeah, try not to stitch a pleat into anything. Okay, I can feel a little lumpy bump right there, so I'm just sticking my finger in there and wiggling back and forth to smooth it out. That looks, when it looks good and feels good, that's what you want. And I love the back of the head. Once you get to the back of her head, it's really a smooth curve. Usually that's a straightaway, and it's an easy finish. There we go. I'll back up again. couple stitches just to reinforce it and stitch off. So just like before, we want to finger press the seam allowance open and trim it down. But we can actually do that step after we stitch this front seam. So I'm going to trim off these extra thread tails here, and we're going to go on ahead and stitch this seam. So all you want to do is arrange the head so you have the center head kind of pull that up a little bit, pull back on that seam allowance, and bring those front, almost straight edges of the face, that short little edge of the face from the dot to the lower edge of the head, of the side head pieces. Bring those in nice alignment. What we're going to do is start on the neck and stitch up to the dot, not past it, just right up to the dot, back stitch, and the head will be complete. So here we go. Get started stitching. Back stitch. Now I'm going to make sure that piece is in nice alignment all the way up, and I'm taking that little bit of seam allowance. This is the little bit of fabric that extends beyond the dot on the head center piece, and I'm just going to pull back on that just to make sure I don't stitch through it. There we go, all the way up and hit that dot and back stitch right there. Now back stitch 3 stitches, come forward 3 stitches, and it's done. So I have trimmed those seam allowances down and pressed them open. And now I'm going to turn this right side out. Might want to take those pins out just so they don't stick me. There we go. And just gently turn that head right side out. And you'll want to check that seam around the face, around Miss Bunny's nose. That's a tricky seam. It's a Y-shaped seam. But the good news is if you don't have things just exactly right, it's not the end of the world, because we're going to cover this area completely with some embroidery floss at the very end to make Miss Bunny have a nice smile. So it's not a big deal if you accidentally stitched a pleat in this area. It looks like some of my stitching might have come loose ever so slightly. Maybe I didn't get a good back stitch, a good securing stitch on one of those sides, and I have a tiny little hole right there. So I might go in with just a little bit of fabric glue on the other side just to fix that. So with that step done, now it's time to think about Miss Bunny's eyes. Now, if you want to do embroidered eyes, you'll need to make sure to mark that dot for her eyes on the right side of the fabric, and you'll be stitching that on at the very end, along with Miss Bunny's nose and mouth. I like to use safety eyes, and that's what I predominantly used for my Miss Bunny dolls. These are plastic eyes with a plastic backing, and they lock in really securely. They don't move. They have a nice look, and I like the idea of using these just simply because if this doll was given to a really young child, these will not come out, and I like that. All right, so here we go. I have marked the eyes on the wrong side, so I'm gonna loop my way inside. I've grabbed a stiletto here, and I'm just going to insert that tip of that stiletto right on that marked dot and just wiggle my way in. Back and forth, I'm just making a little hole. So that didn't make quite a big enough hole, so I'm gonna clip a little bit with a pair of scissors, just a little bit to the left and right. And now, yeah, I can easily insert my eye. And just make sure that's all the way going through. And then now I'm gonna cap it with the safety eye. And I found that just a little bit tricky to pull through, so I found it great. Grab a spool of thread like this one that has a small hole in it, and I just go and line up that prong of the safety eye over that hole, and then I can press firmly down and really use some pressure. I like that. You want to just be nice and square and straight. And you can see it popped up nicely, and that's what it looks like on the wrong side. So if you're using safety eyes, go on ahead and install them now, because you won't be able to access the back side of the head after this point. Now that we have the head complete, let's start working on the body. We have a body front, and that really doesn't need any extra work, but our body back needs a few lines of stitching in order to get it ready to go. First thing to do is stitch your darts just exactly the same way you stitch the darts on the head. You're going to bring the wide edges together, just like that, and stitch along that line, back stitching at both ends to secure it. Then you'll take the body back right sides together and stitch from those dots to the edges. Remember to back stitch at the dot, go all the way to the edge, back stitch again, same thing down here. What that's going to do is leave a nice wide opening in the center of the back. And here's what that's going to look like once you get your darts stitched, just like so, and you see that opening in the body back. What that's going to allow you to do is to turn the body right side out really easily, and you'll want to press that seam allowance open. It's also going to be really easy to seam that closed at the very end. Okay, so now that you have your body front and back stitched, line these up right sides together and stitch just the shoulder seams. You're going to start at the neck edge, swing around, again, making sure always to back stitch at the beginning and end of every seam. Now I'm just trimming up those shoulder seams nicely. This is one seam where I actually don't press that open. I just typically press that to one side, usually the front, and that works out fine. And I just realized I forgot to trim up this back seam, but I want to be careful about how I trim this. I don't want to trim through this area where I have the opening. I want to give it a little angle there. So I have it trimmed down close, about 1/8 of an inch from the stitching where the back is seamed up, but where I have the opening, just leave the seam allowance the full width. And that's going to, again, help you be able to stitch up that opening whenever your doll is finished. Just like that. That looks great. So now we're going to grab that head piece again, and we're going to stitch the two of these together in the neck area. First thing I want to do is make sure that my Miss Bunny head is 100% done, and she's looking good. I got her ears, I got her eyes, she's ready to go. So I want to turn her head so it is facing the front body. And you know the front from the back because it doesn't have any stitching, it doesn't have a seam anywhere. And if the front fold line, there was a fold when we cut this fabric, if that line has started to get a little faint, you could always mark that. But I can see mine pretty well. I'm going to set this to the side so I can really work on it. But what I'm going to do is line up that center seam of Miss Bunny's face. Let me unfold it here so you can see it. So there is the center seam of Miss Bunny's face, where her mouth will be, and that is lined up with the center fold of the front body. I'll flip it back over here. And this is pretty tight, and I found that this is kind of pretty much the smallest circle you can stitch, with a nice patchwork foot attached. So it's just a little bit tricky, and be mindful of that. Take your time and go on ahead and pin these pieces in place so that way it's going to be really easy to stitch. And also understand you can also hand baste the pieces together, and that can make it a little bit easier too. Okay, so I've lined up those pieces. I'm going to place a pin right there. Now the darts on Miss Bunny's face, let me pull back, you can see it. The dart is pointing, I've pressed that dart back, so it's pointing to the back of her head, and that will match up with her shoulder seam. It's designed to do that. So I usually press that shoulder seam to the front and then have the dart pressing to the back. And again, I'll place another pin, like so, and I'll do the same thing on the opposite side. And the back, on the back of the head, we have these two angles coming down. Now, pretty much the center point of those two angles should line up with that center back seam. So I'm going to flip that over and just kind of guesstimate the center point between those two head seams and place one final pin right there. Okay, this is probably the trickiest seam to stitch on the doll. So if you want to, grab a needle and thread and go on ahead and baste it in place just so it's easier to stitch. I'm going to take it to my machine and I'll show you how to stitch it. Now I just got in the habit at the very beginning of always piecing this from the front. So I always start where Miss Bunny's face line matches up with the front fold, and that's where I like to start. I'll just slide it underneath my foot. And there's a couple things you got to watch out for here. This is such a small circle. As you can see, it's really about the same length opening as your foot. So we're going to take about 3 stitches at a time before we have to shift and wobble things around. So here we go, about 3 stitches, and then I'll back stitch just to get it nice and secure. And then let's take 3 stitches. And the thing that you really have to watch out for, the edge of this likes to catch on your presser, on your needle as it goes up and down. So that's the thing to really watch out for. You don't want it to catch the fabric and pull. It'll jerk it right out of your hands, and it might even rip the fabric. That happened to me a time or two. Alrighty, we're going to work our way around. We're coming around the shoulder seam, and just watching out for my needles. I don't want to stitch through them if I can help it, but these are really thin needles, so even if I do, it's not the end of the world. Okay, this is looking pretty good. Looks like my seam allowance has winged up on me though. I'm going to drop my needle down and poke at that seam allowance so it pokes right back under and goes the right way. There we go. Sometimes you gotta tell it who's boss. Alrighty, now I'm going to slide that pin out before I hit it. Okay. Now I'm going over that head pleat, and that's just a little bit bulky. Again, you might want to grab the back of it and just help feed it through. Now we're sliding things around to face the back. Like I said, it's just a few stitches at a time. It's just that little tricky bit. And watch out for those pins, they can stick you. There we go. I'm going to smooth out that seam allowance so it's nice and flat. And if ever, you're just feeling confused or discombobulated about something, take it off your machine, do some hand basting. That is absolutely not against the rules, and it oftentimes will save you some time. It really will. You won't have any pins in the head anymore that could stick you, and all the layers will be nicely evened out. I really do advise hand basting if this is just seeming like it's not coming together for you well. Woo, that was a little bit of a weird catch there. Let's see if I can get back on track. There we go. Okay. Now I'm swinging around for this side head. And I hope you can see it's just a few stitches at a time, and it's mostly watching out for this top edge catching on this side of the needle bar. That's just really the tricky thing here. And some needle bars are even wider and can really hook you. So just watch out for that. I'm going to take out that pen. And if your seams don't match up perfectly, please don't freak out. It's not the end of the world if your side darts don't match up with the side seams, the shoulder seams. That's not the end of the world. There we go. Now I'm on the home stretch here. Just want to make sure I don't stitch a pleat in it. There we go. Maybe 1 or 2 more rotates before it's done. There we go. Now I'm going to back stitch, and that head is stitched on. Yay! So I'm just trimming up that neck seam we just stitched, and now I will take a look at how this matched up. So back of the head, we have those 2 seams coming down, and they lined up pretty nicely in the middle of that center back seam. Side dart here coming in and matching up nicely with the shoulder seam, and same thing on the other side, and the front matched up really nicely with that center fold on the front of the body. So all around, really nice. And Miss Bunny is starting to take shape. So next step is to attach her arms and legs, and then stuff our doll, and she will be complete. So now I'm going to turn Miss Bunny's head inside out and shove her ears up into the head, just like so. And what this is just doing is making sure that those ears are out of the way while we stitch all of our body parts on. So here we go. This is what Miss Bunny should look like at this stage. I'm going to flip her over so I've got the back facing up, and that's the side with the opening in it. We're going to take that and flip it up, so that way we can see the right side of Miss Bunny. All right, so I'm going to grab a finished arm, and you can see how we've done that cinch stitch right across, and that's going from seam to seam, so that way we have a thumb pointing up or a thumb pointing down. Now I think it looks best when Miss Bunny has her thumbs pointing up. So that's how I'm lining this up, thumb pointing up, and then I'm setting up over here on this side. I'm going to place that top seam right next to that shoulder seam, and I'll go on ahead and pin it in place. And it's a good idea to do a baste stitch, just a really wide stitch length, and maybe stitch about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. That helps you stop from having arms or legs that wobble out of place. So that's a really good idea. I'm going to pin it just for speed in this tutorial, but definitely take the time to baste it in place. And you can see the lower edge of the arm lines up with that little notch right there. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. And yes, the upper parts of these arms and legs are not stuffed. Those are empty. And we're also going to noticeably change the way we stuff the upper arms. That's going to be a lot looser because otherwise I found whenever I really stuffed both sections of the arms, the upper and lower sections, it ended up making the doll really stiff. But we'll get into that in just a bit. Here we go. Now I'm going to line up this side. And again, double check, thumb pointing upward, just like so. And it helps, I'm left-handed, so I'm always inserting my pins from the left. It helps if you have all of your pins inserted so that the ball, the end, is pointing to the outside, so that way you can take them out as you are sewing. So I'm going to shift these around over here real quick so they're the same way. There we go. Okay, so we've got our arms in place, and this is where things just kind of start to get a little bit wobbly bobbly. And what I'm going to do, just to keep it under control, is I'm going to stick those arms through that back hole, just like so, just to keep them out of my way. And you can see we still have the right side of the body front face up. Now, this is the confusing part. We're going to put the legs in place. And I did this wrong 2 times on 2 different Miss Bunnies. So it's very, very easy to do this wrong. But basically what you want to do is take the leg and make sure that the curve is going to be face up like this, and then take it and rotate it so it's face down. And that works for me because I can see this is the right side of her body, and that's how the leg is supposed to go whenever her body is right side out. But because she's being sewn inside out, that's the way the leg should go right now. So that way the curve is pointing down towards the table. And yeah, like I said, it's easy to get that wrong. So don't worry if that happens to you. It's just one of those things that's easy to kind of get flipped around in your head. Okay, so these seams here, we have the seam that went around the leg. They should be stacked up on top of one another. And I'm going to line up first the edge of that leg. It's like folded edge here. I'm going to line up one side with the notch for that leg. I line up the inner notch first, and then I line up the outer notch, because you can see we've got a straight edge of the leg, but we're fitting this into a curve. And unless you want Miss Bunny's legs to be kind of crossing in a weird way, you want this to come in nice and straight, just like this. So you're going to have a little bit of extra fabric here, like a little triangle of fabric extending. And that is the way it's supposed to be if you want her legs to come in nice and straight. So there we go. We've got one leg in place, and you can double check yourself. You fold it down, then the leg is curving the right way. We're going to do the same thing again. Place the leg, stack up those seams, and line it up with the inner mark, and I just do these like little tiny little notches in the fabric. It's barely 1/8 of an inch, but please feel like if you don't like that method for marking, you can also just use a marking pencil. That works great too. There we go. So I've got that side pinned in place, and then make sure that that's stacked up really nicely and pin the other side in place too. And as you can see, we're going to have just that little tail over here on this side of the leg that extends beyond the curve of that front edge. Just like that, that little notch over there. That's the way it's supposed to be. Okay, so now we're going to take the legs and stick them up through that center back hole, just like so. And you can see why it's definitely a good idea to leave these upper sections of the arms and legs empty, because otherwise this would just be way too bulky. It would be almost impossible to turn her and be able to stitch this last seam. Okay, so now she's looking like an alien. There's something coming out of your back. But yeah, this is the way it's supposed to look. It's a little messy right before the end. So now what we're gonna do is pull down that back and line it up with the front so they're stacked really nicely together. We can go through and line up the marks that we have for the arms. So there's a mark right there. I can line that up and give it a pin. Same thing over here. Line up those arm marks, give it a pin. And it depends on how much, how many different pins that you want to put in this. There is just a little bit of easing that will happen right through this curve. So the first thing you want to do is you want to line up the center fold on the front body with the center back seam on the back body. So I'm just going to line that up just like that. Have a pin. And then I'm also going to line up the leg marks too. And this was one thing that really confused Dad. Dad was trying to line up the dart that's kind of on Miss Bunny's butt. He was trying to line that up with the mark for the leg on the front, and it totally wasn't working. And yeah, it wasn't designed to do it that way. So yeah, make sure to line up the marks for the legs, not the darts. The darts are not meant to line up with anything, so don't worry about that. And you can see we have just a little bit of extra fabric here, and it's just going to ease through as you stitch it. It's going to sort itself out. And if you want to, though, you can place a pin or two here along the side. That works great. Just 1 or 2 pins here just to hold the fabric in place. So we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Remember, that little back dart doesn't match up with anything. It's the leg marks that are supposed to stack up on top of one another. There we go. Got a little pin. All right, this is looking good. It looks like we're ready to go. We're going to take this to the machine and we're going to stitch around, securing everything in place all at once. So I'm going to start up here on her shoulder, back stitch all the way around the bottom of the body and back up to the opposite shoulder and another back stitch. So let's take it to the machine and get Miss Bunny finished up. So I've just smoothed out that fabric and made sure I don't have any sort of pleat or weird thing going on with that arm going right up against that shoulder seam. I'm going to slide the whole thing underneath the foot and take a couple stitches and then take a couple back stitches. There we go. And I like to hang on to those threads just to make sure they don't get sucked down in the machine, don't do anything weird. All right, there we go. So now from here, I'm just going to go slow, work my way up to a pin, make sure the needle stops in the down position, and then take out that pin and move to the next one. The biggest thing here is obviously we've got all of these arms and legs sticking out. Just keep them out of your way. Just nudge them out of your way whenever they're getting around and banging up against your machine. It's not a big deal. Okay, and like I said, we have just a little bit of fitting here, a little bit of ease going through the front and back body. Not a lot, but it's just one of those things you might want to just mush on it a little bit. Make sure you're not going to stitch a pleat. And then as we come up to that dart, I like that dart to face up, to point up like this towards the shoulder seam. There we go. Just let the whole thing feed through the machine nicely. Okay, now I'm coming up on the legs, and this gets just a little bit bulky, especially as we stitch over that set of seams right through the center of the leg. So here we go, and you can see that little bit here winging out. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. But we're following the curve of the fabric, just like so. All right, now I'm making sure that the center back seam is stacked up nicely on top of the center front fold. There we go. And I feel things are just a little bit lumpy here, so I'm going to take my time. If you have to, just lift up on it and take a look at the fabric, see what it's doing. If it feels like it's doing something weird, you know, the seams aren't stacking on top of one another, you're getting fabric bunching up in a strange way, just stop and check it. It saves you so much time to stop and check in versus stitching a pleat and then having to rip it out and mess around with that whole 9 yards. Okay, this is feeling good. And once you stitch that first pleat, you have it facing up, then you know this one coming around the opposite way, it's going to be facing the opposite. There we go. Another pin. And I did not pin through here, so I got a little bit of easing to do. If you need to, stick your thumb inside that back and wiggle around on the fabric a little bit. That works great. And I do find it really helps to, whenever you know a seam has a little bit of ease, try and start working it out from the very beginning. Don't wait until this last ½ inch to try and work out any excess fabric that you've got in that seam. Okay, we're coming up on the arm. Again, I want to just feel through all those layers. I want to make sure that I don't have any kind of weirdness going on, any pleats, any wobbly fabric under there. I want it to be smooth sailing. Okay. And I will say, I do usually now baste the arms and legs in place. You can obviously do it without. I did not baste these arms and legs in place, but I had one situation where legs slipped as I was stitching it on, and it really ended up slightly lopsided and very odd in the finished doll. So if you're struggling with that, definitely baste the arms and legs in place, and that will certainly speed up the process. So now I'm just trimming up that seam I just stitched all the way around, just cutting right through the middle to trim it down to 1/8 of an inch wide. And that can be a little bulky in some places where you've got the arms and legs, so just take it slow. And now it's time to turn her right side out. This is the exciting part. So just gently tug on the arms and legs and start working her out the right way. There we go. And same thing with the arms, just give them a tug. And reach inside and grab her ears that we stuffed up inside the head. All right, now turn that right side out. And there we go. And I know at this stage she still looks pretty wobbly, but that's just simply because she needs to be stuffed. So here is how you're going to stuff her. Just lay her out like this and grab my fiber fill again. I just pull off some nice big clumps here to work with just to get started. Give it a little fluff so it's nice and soft. And then I like to start with her head, just simply because it's so nice to be able to see her face, you know, coming and forming its nice shape. So I go through the center back for her face and up into her head. And it will probably surprise you just how much stuffing it requires to fill up a doll completely, because you really want the head and these lower limbs to be nice and stiff. That really gives the whole doll definition, and it really looks the best. Now, you don't want as much stuffing in the upper arms and legs, because then it starts to just become too stiff. So here we go. I think I've got that upper head really nice. Another thing that I do as I'm stuffing is I'm just kind of smoothing on those seam allowances. And sometimes you'll see where a seam allowance kind of flops from one side to the other side, and that can make it look a little bit lumpy. Reach your finger in there. And what you can do is you can either encourage the seam to open, or you can encourage the seam just to lay flat to one side or the other. There's no right or wrong way of doing this, really. But I'm encouraging this seam to curl towards the side head, and that is automatically making it not only look better, but it's also resting. I hope you can see how much smoother that looks now, because before I had a little bit of seam allowance kind of pulling this way and a little bit of seam allowance pulling this way. That's a subtle thing, you know. After you make 5 or 6 dolls, you're going to start picking up on little things like that. For your first doll, it's not a big deal. I wouldn't be too worried about it. Okay, so now I'm adding a bit more, and this is really going to start filling up her nose. And yes, this nose had just a little bit of an issue. I think I just missed one stitch, maybe on both sides. I just needed to be a little bit tighter to that center dot, and that's okay, because we're going to do a little bit of hand stitching to cover that up and finish up her face. So it's okay if your nose doesn't come out just exactly perfect. This is the perfect example of throw more thread at it. You can always cover it up with nice stitching. So there we go. That is feeling good. So a good firm pack. You know, her face is still pretty squishy, but it's a firm, dense pack, so she has good definition. There we go. Now we'll start on the body. And I like to pull it out and just give it a little bit of a fluff. What I have found, let's say you're taking stuffing out of a doll or something like that, and it's just gotten really compacted, I found that that's when it can really have a very lumpy effect inside the body. So watch out for that. I did play around with other types of fiber fill, and played around with cotton as well as polyester, and I really like this fluffy polyester the best. That's just my opinion. But the cotton had a very, very dense feel to it. It didn't pack as soft or as springy. Of course, I have not tried wool yet, and I know that wool fiber fill is a little bit more common in other countries. So if that's something that you have available, try that. See if that works better. There we go. Now the shoulders are one place that you kind of want to watch out for. If you want her arms to stick out straight, like she's a tightrope walker, then you'll want to fill in the shoulder and squish and manipulate the stuffing so that it really fills in that whole corner. If you want her to have droopy arms so that she can, you know, kind of have her arms crossed, or have them down in the front for, you know, over her lap or something like that, or you want her to cross her arms, something like that, well, then she's going to need a lot more wiggle room here. So watch out for that. If you like her to really have positionable arms where you really want to play with her a lot, then be careful how much you fill in that area. Instead, focus on packing a good bit in her butt so she can sit down nicely. She doesn't have very big darts, so she won't set up on her own without a little bit of a prop up behind her. But there's enough here that if you really nicely pack it and fill it, then she will set up nicely. There we go. You can see she'll kind of lean forward or lean back, but the more fiber fill you add in that area, the more stable she will be. There we go. That is looking good. You want it to be firm but still squishy. A little bit more. And you can see why we left the seam allowances full size on both sides of that hole. You can see I still have my full 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I still have that nicely pressed open, and that's going to make stitching up this center back seam so much easier. Okay, we're looking good. Give her a little squish. I like those shoulders. I think maybe just a little bit more stuffing up in her neck. You kind of just have to go a handful at a time after you really get the main body filled. And then squish on it a little bit, give it a little, you know, squish and squeeze and see if that's where you like it. There we go. So that looks really good. Now for the arms and legs, I was talking about this earlier, just how it's important not to go overboard with the arms and legs. Again, if you want arms that stick straight out and don't droop at all, then you can go crazy with this. You can really pack her tight. You want to pack up those shoulders real tight, and you want to pack up the upper arms real tight. But if you'd like a doll that, you know, has nice curvy, soft, floppy arms, then this is about as much fiberfill as you want to put in that area. In fact, actually, this might be a little bit much. Let's see. So I'm going to get started here. And we have openings in the upper arms, and it's going to be the lower edge here of the upper arms. We made that opening when we were stitching from the dot to the edges at the very, very beginning. So that's why we left that area open. I'm going to grab my chopstick here, because that is not wanting to go in easily. Maybe I just need to use my pinky finger rather than my index finger. There we go. Okay, that's feeling pretty good. Yeah, I only needed half. That is honestly about as much as I would stuff in that area. Maybe just a little bit more. Go just a bit more in that upper area. You want it to feel nice and soft here. She doesn't need a lot of definition through that upper arm. The upper arms are generally covered, you know, when she's wearing her dress and that kind of thing. So that area, it's okay for that to be nice and floppy, so that way you can do more with the doll. You can, you know, cross her arms, you know, you can have her holding something, that kind of thing. And that's because you've left a good amount of movement here in that upper arm and in that little pocket right there on the shoulder. The legs, you know, you could stuff those quite full, or you could leave them fairly empty the same way. I like to leave mine fairly empty simply because I find that she usually will set up nicely with the legs only softly filled. So again, in this case, we've got this back opening. So again, that was an opening left whenever we were stitching from dot to dot. And I'm just inserting a little bit of fluff here. Definitely use your chopstick. It makes this so much easier in these little tiny places. There we go. A little bit of fiberfill on one side. And about, yeah, I'll probably do that much and fill in the rest of the leg. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish filling up all of these spaces, but you are probably wondering, how do we stitch them up? How do we finish her so she's no longer going to be leaking stuffing anywhere? So I have a needle and thread here, very simple overhand knot on the end. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pack that stuffing down so I'm sure that it's nice and even, and I'm just going to squish that opening to bring those folded edges together, just like so. And now I'm going to insert the needle inside that opening, and I'm actually going to have the tip of the needle come out actually a little bit of distance away from the dot where that opening began. And the reason being, I want to get started there where it's nice and secure. And that's where my knot is going to be, right there on the back side. Okay, so now this is kind of an applique stitch. It's a little bite into that fold and then a little bite into the opposite fold. So that area was where it had already been secured and stitched. Now I'm into the open area. And so it's just a little bite into that fold where the seam allowance is going into the back of the body, and then a little bite here. And I'm not going to pull it tight so that way you can see how my stitches are stretching across. You can see I've got my finger in there, and that's really just to give you a contrast so you can really see the stitching here as I go from edge to edge right across. There we go. So I'd say about 1/2 inch, and then give it a tug, and you can see what that's going to look like. It completely seals it up. Now if you want to be extra sure that it's going to be secure, then do an occasional back stitch. So in this case, I'm going to stitch all the way around again. I'm going to go backwards through this fold, and then go back through the front. So I basically went over that area twice. There we go. Okay. So from here, I'm just going to continue that stitching. I'm going to take a little bite into the fold on that upper edge, and then a little bite into the fold on that lower edge, just like so. Now to tie off and bury this thread tail, I'll get down here. I'm going to back stitch. So that is basically, I'll take a stitch, then I'll go back through that stitch again. Then I'll probably do that twice and then tie my thread tails in a knot and then send those thread tails like this. So I'll insert, let's just tighten this one up and you can see, I'm going to insert the needle into that fold, into the body, and run the needle a distance away, just like that. And then when I pull through, it will pull the knot and secure the thread tails all at once. So that's how I'm going to seal up all these edges just as soon as I get Miss Bunny stuffed up and finished. And here is what a finished doll looked like when she was done. You can see that nice center back seam all sealed up. Same thing with her arms and legs. Very, very simple stitching. Now you might be wondering about her face, how we do this stitching to create her nose and her mouth. So let's do that next. So it's time to add Miss Bunny's face. I've cut a length of pink embroidery floss. I've done a overhand knot here on the end. But before I start stitching, I have learned the hard way that this is one of those things that's just, it's really nice to have a little bit of a game plan as to what you're doing. And if you want to smile, you know, if you want to do something complicated, then it's a good idea just to grab a marking pencil and mark it. So I like a real simple mouth. I just do a little straight line to both sides, basically an upside down V. If you want it to be more of a smile, then you could add an extra line going off in both directions. It's also a good idea to mark where you want her nose to stop and make sure that's a straight line across. I did stitch an occasional crooked nose on my Miss Bunny doll, and that's a little disappointing. So make sure to actually lift it up and hold it so that you're looking at her face parallel with yours, and that will help you be able to see if you were accidentally. I find that when I have her laying down, I tend to mark even a crooked line on her face. So there we go. I like that. That looks really good. And I'm going to grab my embroidery floss. This is just a short length. And because I have that hole in the nose, I'm just going to use that. I'm just going to go right through that hole and insert my needle in the bottom edge of where I want her mouth to be and pull through. Just like so. And that knot went right through that nose hole and now is right on the other side of that stitch. Okay. So now I'm going to go up, back through that hole, and insert my needle, and trying to make sure that where this is coming out and where my needle tip is coming out, those are roughly symmetrical. There we go. So that's the first stitch. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to stitch back this way and through that same hole again. Pull through. And this is one of those things you want to just be really gentle and mindful, because if you start to pull too tight, you want kind of a medium pressure on these stitches, but if you start to pull too tight, then you can really start to distort Miss Bunny's face. So be careful. Okay, and now basically I'm doubling her mouth so that there's 2 lines of thread going over this area. So now again, I'm going to go through the tip of her nose, down to the tip of her mouth, just like so. And I just like that. It really adds a nice bit of definition. Okay, so now I want to start filling in the nose. So I'm going to stitch through that hole. Actually, I'm going to go in the seam allowance right here, just to make sure that this last line of stitching, that stitch is really nice and secure. And then I'm coming up about midway up that nose, and I'm right to the side of the seam. I'm not going through the seam, I'm going to the side of the seam. There we go, pull up. And now we're going to start stitching across the nose. And again, you want to be sure that you're stitching straight across and not accidentally crooked, unless that's what you're going for. There we go. So I'm just going to insert the needle on that side, and then I'm going to just take a little stitch down that seam. So I'm running the needle parallel with that seam between the side head and the center head pieces. Pull through. And again, just watch your tension. You don't want so much tension on your stitches that you're distorting her face and causing pleats, but you also don't want it so loose that the stitches are kind of flopping around and might, come out with wear. So there's a balancing act here, and I think practice is really key more than anything else. If you want to practice this a few times on just plain fabric, that's a good idea. Okay, so now I'm going to go straight across up here, and you can see I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to stitch and go all the way across the nose through the back. I found that when I did it that way, it was really easy to pull my stitches too tight and cause pleats to form. So instead, I'm stitching across and then down the seam and then across again. And I just like that. I found that that worked a little bit better, and I was a little bit less likely to pull my stitches too tight. So now I'll go up, and now I'm working to kind of fill in. So I set up and stitch across a few times, and then now I go and start filling in and adding stitches between. So I'm going to go all the way down and do some stitches across that tip of the nose. I had a little hole in my nose, so I want to make sure that I put enough stitches there to really hide that. Like I said, you can throw more thread at it, not a big deal if you make a mistake. Now I'll go all the way up. There we go. That's looking really nice. And across, that looks like that is enough stitching going across at least the upper part of the nose. I think I'll go down again. A few more lines of stitching across that little tip. I'm going to go all the way down. And you can make the nose smaller. This is actually a fairly big nose. I made this one, fairly long. You can make it much smaller if you don't like embroidery that much and you're a little nervous about your stitches, and you can make this nose a lot smaller. And you could paint this on too. You don't have to do embroidery floss. If you had some fabric markers, something like that, that would definitely work. Again, I would practice it on fabric first, maybe even cut out and piece an extra head, just to have something to practice on. And then once you know exactly what you're doing, then you'll be able to tackle it with confidence, and that'll be great. I'm having trouble getting, and this is the thing, there's seam allowances through there, and it's a little tricky, so I'm having trouble coming up through there. So instead, I'm going to take that needle up to a further place. So if ever you're trying to stick your needle in and it's just not working, maybe just pick another spot. This is looking good. I like to occasionally stop and give Miss Bunny's face just a little squeeze and make sure that those stitches are coming in, have nice definition, and are being stitched at the right tension. So again, not distorting her face. All right. Again, I've got just every once in a while, I just feel like there's a lot of bulk, and it is a very bulky area in general. So just take your time. Sometimes you'll just have to be a little bit aggressive to get your needle across, get your needle through. That's okay. And sometimes you might have to double up on something. Like it looks like right now I need to go right across here, but it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to. So I'm going to go on ahead and take my stitch, roll all the way up to the top, and do another stitch across. I don't think that'll look bad. I think that'll look great. And I'll come down and do that last stitch. And I gotta say, every single face I've done on every single Miss Bunny doll I've done, and I think I'm upwards in the 12 or 15, 15 dolls at this point. Every single face has been different. You know, sometimes they go real easy and sometimes they're a little bit trickier, and every single one is just a different experience. And I think the more that you do this, then you'll get a game plan, you'll get a system that really works for you. There we go. That looks good. I think one more stitch across. And now I'm going to bring the needle up through the middle of the doll. There we go. So I've got one more stitch, and basically I'm just going across and then up through the middle of that nose. So I'm bringing my needle through where I can tie a knot and then be able to hide it. And I know everything just got really wonky and weird because I pulled that stitch just a little bit too tight. So you can see what I'm talking about. With the tension of your stitching is really important, but don't worry, don't panic. You can always fix it. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is tie a knot, just another overhand knot, make a loop, pass your thread. Here, I'll go a little slower just in case you missed that. I've got a loop and I pass the needle up through that loop. I'm not going to tighten this down all the way to the fabric. I'm going to leave about 1/8 of an inch between Miss Bunny's nose and that knot. Now I'm going to try and insert the needle right back into that hole. So it's going right back through the hole I just made with the thread. Now I'm sending that needle out through her cheek. And what this is going to do is it's going to leave a nice long thread tail inside her head, and it's going to allow me to bury that knot if I pull and it cooperates with me. Let's see, did it go through? Usually you hear it pop. It didn't pop. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. This one's deciding it doesn't want to work with me. There it goes, just went through. Now obviously, as I mentioned before, a little bit of a distortion here. So this is where I feel like, you know, take your needle and kind of just fluff at the stitches. I usually go from here and just work at those stitches back and forth, just kind of slide it through, back and forth. What that does is it helps them lay flat, give her face just a little massage, and that can help as well. So I had to take a minute there to manipulate those stitches a bit. What I did was I took my needle and inserted it through the top and just gently wiggled it back and forth. And what this does is, let's say you have a single line stitched across that's a little bit too tight. As you wiggle your needle back and forth, it just kind of sorts out those tension issues. I think I still have a slightly tight stitch down here at the bottom. And this might take just a little bit of a wiggle just to start really encourage those stitches to balance. And then also it encourages the threads to smooth out and become nice and flat running across Miss Bunny's nose. It also helps to give her face a little squish like this in your hand. So then that way all of those, the fiber fill will come back. It's real easy as you're stitching to kind of compress that too. So lots of different things to keep in mind. Don't get frustrated if your first face or even your 10th face is not exactly perfect. I'm sure that whoever you give your Miss Bunny doll to is going to love it. So that's it for this tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed making Miss Bunny with me today. Now you can find her pattern along with her dress and basic panties all in her pattern at leahday.com/bunny. You'll also be able to find all of the tutorials that I have shared on making this doll, all linked up together right there too. So come and check it out at leahday.com/bunny. Now, if you'd like to know the backstory of Miss Bunny and who she is and what her personality is like, then you will enjoy learning more about her in the book, Mally the Maker and the Queen in the Quilt. This is a quilt fantasy story about a little girl named Mally, her best friend Miss Bunny, and their adventures in a magical quilt world. So come and find the book at leahday.com/Mally. Until next time, let's go sew.